as Einstein said, if this square represents the problem, if you approach the problem with your old way of thinking, where do you end up? At the same problem. And he says something to the extent of you have to expand your consciousness beyond the problem to find a solution. And the main thing we struggle with is that we have to let our old self go. And we as human beings, we struggle with change. It's like that cocoon, the caterpillar in the cocoon. It means letting go of being a caterpillar. We don't know what the heck it's like to be a butterfly. And that's the challenge. You actually have to let go of your old self. When you go through heartache, when you go through challenges in your workspace, you actually have to shift as a person and you have to metamorphosize, catalyze into a different being completely in terms of mental and emotional. And that's why we struggle. And we'll chat about that. So this is not a good space, right? And then you try your utmost, though, to break out of that space. As you said, your mind's thinking overtime. And one of the things you might do is, as people say, at a very basic level, they say, just snap out of that space, all right? We may say, I even behave a bit impulsively. You might even get angry and frustrated. Aggressive. Yes, I'll write the word aggressive up here. All right? You're more likely to shout and scream and fight and become harmful towards who? Yourself and others around you, because they have to deal with your emotional outbursts. You're more likely to become violent, what else? Obnoxious, arrogant, compared to how others see you. All right? This is how others see you. If you've got me less than others, that means people are telling you what to do. On this side, don't tell me what to do. I don't need any medication. I'll sort this out myself. I'll show you who's boss. You basically have lost control. All right? Whereas we put abused on that side, on this side it's abusive. All right? And what else we can put other words: bitter, desperate, angry, shouting, screaming, fighting, all these things. Good space or bad space? And you kind of figured what words fit on this side. Because when you're depressed, you're low. But what you do is, one of the things we as humans do to break out of a depressive state is we raise our energy levels. You build yourself up. I'm going to get up in the morning. I want to do all that, but we get into an angry, irritable, frustrated state. Also, interestingly, if you're young or old, which side will be young and which side will be old? Old and young, right? Young, you got energy, and you use it in an angry, irritable state. In fact, even politicians, we know, the young parties are more likely to, we see it, right? And the old parties, I'll show you who's boss. They probably will have a heart attack getting out of that, wherever they sit, right? Because they don't have the energy levels, right? So there's you on one side and the other on the other side. Both, we agree, are not good spaces. Okay? By a show of hands, how many of us are more on the passive side? Wow. And how many on the aggressive side? All right? And it's interesting, very few on this side, most of us on that side, right? And there's been times in this very room where I've given the same talk, and the majority of the room said they're more on the aggressive side. All right? So we never one or the other completely. We mixtures of both. In fact, to be the passive side, you have to have this as well. And as just saying, there's been times in this room where when I walked in and I asked, how many of you are on the passive side? And very few would put up their hands. And many would put up their hands on this side. And I'd ask, and I'd look at the energy in the room. It was so down. It was like people had walked in on hospital gurneys. And as you're saying, along the lines of why they would identify with the aggressive side, even though they look so passive, is there's a war going on in everyone's minds. And they feel the aggression and anger, but you can't express it on the outside. So what happens is you just have to brush them a few times, and lo and behold, the monster comes out. Okay? And not just someone out there, it can be us. All right? Some people say, you don't mess with me. And then eventually the wolf comes out. All right? The Wolverine, because this is the anger, shouting and screaming that comes flying through the door. So be wary, we have both, as you're saying, and we project it onto others. So we'll explore that, right? So there's us, most of us identified on this side. It's something very important. Did you just wake up one morning and feel depressed, hopeless, shout, scream? No, it built up over time, right? What happened over time that it built up? The people. You look at all the things you mentioned, the triggers, events, traumas, 99.9% is people and person. We don't react to the walls. As much as you love the office park you work in, you know the first time you drive up, wow. It's about the people that you're going to engage with in the workspace. You can go to a dodgy, middle of nowhere place, but if you're hanging out with cool people, you feel so, you'll be okay there. What made your school life great? Not the fact that it had 10 football grounds. It was the fact that the 10 people you hung out with made your school life great and your teacher. You and I, 99% of the time, react and respond to people and persons. Yes, the 1% is you may have a disease. So what happens is, yes, illness can be one, and the other one is where a natural disaster. All right? That's also can push us into a negative position. In this day and age where we generally may hopefully avoid natural disasters, hopefully this pandemic will end soon and there won't be one for the next, hopefully another 50, 100 odd years, okay? It generally is people and persons in your life that push us one way or the other. And you and I know over the years, this is the reason why we feel one way or the other. So there's us sitting on the one side. What's fascinating, and it relates to what you just said, is that if you are sitting, if I use a different color, if you are sitting on this end, on this pendulum, what's interesting, if you're saying you are abused, where's that word abused? If you are abused, what you're telling me is that there was someone who was abusive. In order to feel that I am greater than others, I'll show you who's boss, I'll show you who's in charge, I will behave in an arrogant and obnoxious manner, then someone has to be me less than others. In order for someone to have lost control, there has to be someone who has no control. In order to feel like the scorpion, someone has to behave like a frog. In order to be a nail, there has to be a hammer. Does that resonate? You cannot have one without the other. You and I project it out on the world. If we view the world as dangerous, shouting, screaming, that means you have to put yourself in the place where you're open to harm. You cannot be on one end without the other end. What happens is, if you are here, you agree this is a state of imbalance, there has to be a factor or factors or persons or people that you put in the position that create the imbalance. That means they're tipping your seesaw. As I've drawn a seesaw, they've tipped your seesaw. So you have to be in this space on this side of the pendulum to facilitate that side. One cannot exist without the other. And that's probably one of the biggest takeaways in this. Now, in your mind, you may have identified all those people, given you said you're on the passive depressed side, that fit in on the angry, shouting, screaming side. And we do this. We all go outside for a coffee break and we invite all of them into this room. Hope we have space enough for everyone that you feel fit in on the angry, shouting side. All right? Okay? Some people have stood up and said, it's just my mother-in-law. All right? Okay? And we stand here and we have that session. I show them this entire talk. All right? And I say, hey, you're the one on the outside, we'll keep you safe, don't worry, that invited you to this room. In relationship to you, where are they? Will they see themselves on the passive side or the aggressive side? Will they say, I was aggressive and abusive and shouted and screamed? Where will they say they are in relationship to you? So now, do we need to have another commission of inquiry to figure out who was the right and who was the wrong, who was the good, who was the bad, who was the ugly, who was the beautiful, and spend a few billion to figure it out and come up with no answer? Who is the right? Who is wrong? So society determines, and society is very interesting because we kind of alluded to society yesterday. Society makes decisions based on who is in power. Okay? If your government decided we should drive now on the right-hand side of the road because that's what they do in Europe and it seems fancy, so, they're the ones in power. Well, they do things like, if they decide they want to change the name of your road, your city, your town, they're in power, all right? Another thing, so society determines that, and what's interesting, we then decide that's right. All right? Because you can't tell your kid, you shall call the city name by that old name because I just like the sound of it. Your kid will be calling it by the new name and see that as right. For example, history books. When I was a young kid, South African history started in 1652, okay? Because the guys in power determined when this guy Van Riebeck came along, that's when history started. No one accounted for the thousands of years before that, okay? Even now, I'm not too sure that whether we account for the thousands of years. So they decide what's right. And when you're a kid of 10 learning about this, you assume that's normal. No one questions or challenges it. So those in power determines what's right. Those in position determine what's right as well. Because you know this in your organization. Your boss tells you, this is how I see the world. Because of their position you determine, and power that comes with position. And those with prestige, because we decide our celebrity knows what's right, what to dress in, how to shave or not shave. Okay, I'm just reminded of, what's this thing called Miami Vice? Okay, where this guy, Don Johnson, used to not shave. Maybe he couldn't afford razor blades at the time and used to wear padded jackets, right? Nowadays, you wouldn't be seen dead with a padded jacket and bright shirts, right? Because it would suggest something or other, right? Besides celebrities, football. I mean, rightfully or wrongfully, there's an ad going around of Cristiano Ronaldo, not an ad, a WhatsApp video, where he moves a cup of Coca-Cola out of and puts a glass or bottle of water in front of him. And apparently that impacted the image of Coca-Cola in a good way. So sometimes they can do, well, they do right, or climate change or something to that extent. However, if they tell you this color is right for this season and everyone throws out their other clothes because this is the wrong color, that can impact negatively as well. So it's interesting what we do. All right, so power, position, prestige, you may say even fame and fortune determines what's right. Now what's interesting, the people you call into a room will argue they're the victims of you. So who is right? It's a very challenging question because it's not about who is right. It is about what is right. And if to maybe say it in a better way, is what is the truth? And the truth may be independent of what you think and what the perpetrator you believe in your mind, who is the perpetrator, may think. Because it's beyond that, it's the truth. And you and I may not be prepared to accept the truth. Because another word we threw in here, to write it down, was you see yourself as a victim. So categorically we feel, I'm going to use the word, pulled in, stuck on the hamster wheel. Before, and I'm going to explore that. In order to be a victim, back in the day, years ago, fortunately, they would physically manhandle you, possibly put you on a ship and cart you to another country. And on the way, if you did anything crazy, well, just try to set yourself free. They whipped you, and you could lose your life in the process. And if you lost your life, they threw you overboard. So that was physical manipulation, right? And that was slavery. So there, you could argue, get out of your victim mindset. A bit challenging, because back then it wasn't about mental slavery, it was about physical slavery. You literally kept some people harnessed, chained. And if you read the original story of the book Roots, they made a movie of it. What is fascinating, because it was written by Alex Haley, about his great-great-great-grandfather, I think it was one of his forefathers. And it was fascinating. He knew the name of his forefather, whose name was Kunta Kinte. Why? Because that particular ancestor, who was brought across from Africa as a slave, was a man of strength in terms of mental and emotional demeanor and perseverance. And he never wanted to be a slave in terms of his spirit. And he made more than one attempt to set himself free, as in escape physically. It got to a point where given his multiple attempts at escape, they chopped half his foot off. And what was fascinating, as much as they physically debilitated him, he mentally and emotionally still pushed himself to the point he kept on to his African roots and challenged the name that they had given him to the point where he says, "My name is Kunta Kinte." And what was fascinating, he shared that with his children, and the generations thereafter maintained that spirit to some extent. And that name was carried forth, and other particular traits. Now you must remember, your whole identity was eradicated as a person if you're a slave. I mean, they took on other names. Alex Haley is completely different from Kunta Kinte, right? You took on the slave master's names. There was all kinds of other things that happened to the lineage along the way. Yet that name sustained itself until Alex Haley himself becomes powerful and writes. Before he writes, he investigates and explores the heritage he comes from. That's why the book is called Roots. To the point where he travels to West Africa, to the village his forefathers potentially might have come from. And he even, on part of his journey and exploration, goes into a ship crossing the sea to try to mimic the conditions that his forefathers came through. And powerfully, the spirit maintained itself, and amazingly, many of us have watched that mini-series, Roots, based on a man's demeanor to never be a victim of other people. He refused to be a victim beyond just physically, and even mentally. And in that story was actually inspirational to loads of African Americans, because here was one man who says, "I will not be subjugated or subdued." Powerful, because many of us will give in. You need to be of strong mind and spirit to hold on to who you are. So what happens is, why I'm sharing that with you, is a person who refused to be broken. And you might say, wait, wow, Alex Haley. Another person I'd like to bring closer to home, who in many ways, his spirit wasn't broken, was, if you read of a person called Steve Biko, in the South African context. Steve Biko, again, if you read his compilation of his writing, he wrote a book called, they put a compilation of his writings together called I Write What I Like. Steve Biko wrote a book, I Write What I Like. Okay, they're a compilation of his writings. And in there, if you read his writings, you'll see such a powerful person in his thinking and feeling. They made a movie about him as well, Cry Freedom. Denzel Washington played his role. Kevin Costner played the friend that he was exposed to during that time. And he was a powerful man, to the point where he was so powerful that they were endeavoring to extract information from him. And they realized they could not break this man. In the end, they put him into the back of a bakkie, as we know, in South Africa, in a police van back in the day, in the 70s. And I think he had no clothes on, had tortured him and transported him naked from Port Elizabeth all the way to Johannesburg. He ended up losing his life. All right? Still Steve Biko's, his writings are so powerful. And this was a man in the 70s, where back then mentally you were completely subjugated, yet refused to take on the mental mindset that was expected of him. I'm not saying again that we be Steve Biko in the sense of losing your life in the sense, but hopefully our struggles warrant a different level of mental resilience and perseverance. In this day and age, we are fortunately, hopefully, not being physically subjugated into slavery. You and I have accepted a mindset which actually makes us, in many ways, slaves to our own minds. Fascinatingly, most of us identified with the passive side. The mindset exists in our minds. We need to let go. Because what happens now is that you and I are particularly wired in a particular way. What has happened is, the example of this is, how do you keep a 500-kilo baby elephant in one place? You take a rope and you take a peg and you hammer the peg into the ground, and the elephant, not knowing better, being a baby elephant, runs around in circles trying to break free. When that elephant is a 5-ton matriarch, how do you keep her in one place? Same rope, same peg, and it stays in one place, even though it could uproot an entire tree. You and I are not necessarily subjugated nowadays physically, but you and I are subjugated mentally. We're in a state of depression. We're in a state of regression. You do not believe the power within you anymore. You feel and think, this is who I am. In order to be a victim, there's something fascinating we all do that allows us to be a victim. What do we have to do in order to facilitate victimhood? You and I need to blame. Generally, we will find a person, people, that we will give them power, a force that keeps us in a position. And the opposite of blame in that context, be it empowerment, is responsibility. You have to take responsibility for how you feel, and what goes with it, and we'll explore this further, is responsibility for others. Because you have to recognize their actions impact on your actions. Their thinking you've allowed to impact on your thinking. Their feelings impact on your feelings. So if someone comes in here shouting and screaming and saying to us, I'll show you who's boss, some of us will say, yeah, sure, I'll show you, in our minds hopefully. But a few of us will actually subjugate and allow that person to behave in that position. And nowadays they don't have to shout and scream. They just walk in, and by default of their power and their position and their prestige, we allow them that control over us. So what happens is, here's we sitting here, and there's the other person sitting here. All right? And as I said, if we invite them in, they will say they're victims. So everyone on this planet sees themselves as victims. From the person in power to the person who's completely disempowered sees themselves as victims. Another example is this. You at work and your boss gives you hell from 9 to 5, 8 to 5. You sit there in this weak position because of their position, their power. You go home and your kid comes to your dad, Mom, I decided with that hammer you gave me to kind of panel beat your car into the shape of a Ferrari. Where are you? Are you on the passive, hopeless side? Yeah, you show, because now you have power, you have position. You couldn't care about prestige with this kid, all right? You show them who's in charge, all right? You are gone onto the aggressive, shouting, screaming side, and there you push the kid into a position of weakness and hopelessness and victimhood. I'm not saying that's the right thing to do in terms of him beating your car, but you get the scenario. And what's interesting, very important as well, is you then end up at the clinic because of all the issues at work, and then you have the family meeting. And all this time to your psychiatrist and psychologist, you've been presenting yourself as a victim, hopeless, the work situation. But your family comes in, your wife or your husband describes you in a manner as diplomatically as possible as a Godzilla or Terminator, right? And your kids reassure, yes, that's who you are. And you're thinking, wait a minute, I'm not that. I'm this hopeless, worthless, depressed victim. Why do we not see ourselves as that, as angry, shouting, screaming? Is what we generally do, this is very important as well, is what identity you and I give value and power to in our lives. And identity is what we give value to, power to, and energy to. What is our focus in our lives? What brings you here is generally that how you identify yourself, and we used the word ego yesterday because ego is part of identity, determines what you've given power to. And once you give that power, if someone comes and literally decapitates you in terms of your belief system, you end up feeling a victim. So generally, South Africans might identify themselves with their work. Many places around the world, we identify with our work. Titles like husband and wife and father are secondary. That's when you one day have enough money, fame, you will then deal with. We generally place that as secondary or tertiary even. Or some of us, it doesn't matter. We are focused on our primary identities. And the problem with that is someone can come along in a position of power and destroy it for us. And lo and behold, we end up in a space of negativity. And then we have to look for other identities. Or we endeavor to go back onto the platform where we feel good about ourselves. So we end up on one space or the other, and we don't like it, right? And even in terms of relationships generally, if someone will say to me, doctor, why do I end up in such negative relationships where the guys are a real scum or she's just a demon or dragon? And we wonder why. Why do we end up in such negative relationships? Or a different scenario is you are in a negative relationship, abuse, hopeless, shouting, screaming going on from your partner's side. He or she leaves the relationship. You go into another relationship. Is it much different? Why not? Because we still carry these words with us. The world will always be this way. In fact, where does this exist? It exists in our minds. Our mind is our world. Something you and I all do in South Africa. Be interesting if you don't. It's a warm day today. You were driving on the freeway with your windows wide open. You pull up at William Nicol off-ramp. It's about 6 in the evening. And 2 people are walking towards your car. What do you do to your car? Close the windows. What drove you? Do you agree you do it instinctively? You don't even think about it. You just do it. Why did you close the windows? Fascinating. We didn't use a logical explanation. We used an emotional explanation. Fear. We are driven by these emotions. Fear fits in. You are fearful fits in on that side. Here, someone's being arrogant and obnoxious and dangerous fits in on that side. We are saying, I don't want to be a nail to someone's hammer. We carry these traits, these personality traits. You see the world this way. As much as you may have decided, I am now emigrating to New Zealand because I decided that's the safest country in the world. You had your windows wide open. You pull up at the traffic lights, as they may call it there, and you're struggling and you're driving, I think, on the right or left side of the road, whichever side they drive on. And someone walks again towards your car. You might instinctively just close your car windows. And everyone around you may look at you weirdly. What the hell's wrong with you? Or you may, as you do in this country, pull up to the stop street and stop your car 100 meters from the stop street. And everyone's like hooting at you. What's wrong with you? And you're like, it's so wired within you. You act in a particular way. Or another one we do, you go to the ATM and someone's already at the ATM. You stand 10 meters behind them. And when you go to your country of your choice, you wonder why everyone's gapping in front of you because they just thought you were admiring the scenery. All right? So these are fascinating traits that we all adopt in terms of victim, victimizer, fear and anger. You create the world. In order to be depressed, you facilitate a world that is dangerous. You actually regress from a space of power. So if you're in a relationship of sorts, okay, with a person, what's the most obvious to do given you want to seek balance in a relationship? I'm going to give what might be seen as a cynical answer, right? And I'm going to change the scenario. Now it's no longer you I'm asking about. It's your 16-year-old daughter with that guy that we won't talk about. You know what I mean? Are you going to tell her, set boundaries, forgive, learn to find middle ground, leave him? I'll call the flying squad, the security, or that uncle, you know, who's got a couple of weapons that he likes shooting off into the air. I'm not saying go that route. Why does the answer change? Because with us, the answer is always too complicated. Doctor, you just don't get it. With everyone else, we always have the most obvious solution. We're so caught up in our minds, we don't see the obvious answer sometimes. That's the nature of the human being. That's why we struggle to let go and have that hallelujah moment, because sometimes it's obvious. But yes, you may have to run away from 1% of relationships. 99% is a bit tough. Like your mother is your mother is your mother, even though we probably will have more boundaries in place with our mom. All right? As much as you decide, I'm emigrating to Canada to get away from her, she is still your mother. Your siblings are your siblings. Your kids are your kids. As much as you think, geez, I know all those traits come from his father or my wife's side rather than my side. We always use these kind of logical thinking. You have to come to terms with your world. 99% you have to work on your world, and that's where you move to a position in the middle. Okay? And that, interestingly, if you move to the middle, this means the pendulum's at center. If the person's on one side or the other of the seesaw, if you stand in the middle of a seesaw and they stand on the other one end, what will happen? It will fall down. They cannot sustain the seesaw if you refuse to play the game with them. this is tough.